Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Fanfiction Tapes. I'm your host today, Maya, pronouns she, her, and I'm joined by...
Vesper.
Jygg, pronouns he, him.
And I'm our producer, Ian, pronouns he, him.
Alright, today's episode is about two major subgenres of fantasy. High fantasy and low fantasy. We're going to start it off with, let's do some definitions. What the hell is high fantasy? And what's low fantasy? And before this episode, we've talked a little bit about how we would define high and low fantasy. And we talked about how prevalent the magical or supernatural was with respect to what we would consider the natural.
Right. We also did a lot of discussion on last week's episode, which our guests today will have no knowledge of because they were not there, and that episode is not published yet as of this recording.
So, high fantasy, in this case, means something where the supernatural is quite common. You're going to see it in your everyday experience. And low fantasy is a case where that supernatural, that magical, is extremely unusual. You might not see it in your life, and then you might ever in your life up until 1 week that goes really, really badly.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I interpreted fantasy as fantasticalness, I suppose, is the phrase for it. I'm actually kind of curious, the conversation which I was not privy to that happened before this about how that relates to the natural. And what is the natural in this case, and then what sort of counts as the fantastical, especially when you have worlds where the two might not really be have discernible differences. I don't know if
I'm using I suppose an excellent thing to do would be defining our frame of reference.
Are we going to have to redefine fantasy again?
Yes.
Well, if you want me to jump in, Lord of the Rings would be considered high fantasy.
Exactly.
Right?
Typically, yeah.
And something like The Magicians would be considered low fantasy.
See,
I'm not really sure how Harry Potter fits into there. And then again with C.S. Lewis, right? Like that's a debatable maybe topic because pretty much those stories are more about the fantasy worlds, although it is still a world within a world type situation or scenario, but I don't really know how to define that. But
see, now you're starting to overlap into like portal fantasy and urban fantasy.
all of the fantasy.
Completely other fantasy subgenres.
yeah, well, I'm not an expert,
See,
and neither are we, but the Wikipedia for, not that Wikipedia is always right, defines the Magicians as low fantasy, and is also, which is stated on its Wikipedia page, and is actually used as an example on the low fantasy page in Wikipedia.
I'm actually kind of curious. You mentioned that Lord of the Rings would count as high fantasy, and this is, again, my personal take. At least as far as the world of the Hobbits is concerned, and or your everyday person living in, say, Rohan or Gondor, to me that would feel like a world that would count as low fantasy. They don't interact with the the fantastical very much until it comes knocking in the form of 200,000 orcs. But
oh boy,
so to me, those worlds, at least in sort of the everyday, feel low fantasy. The adventures and the mythos is very high fantasy, but the everyday feels low fantasy. So I don't know if that means like just the story itself as we see it is high fantasy because it involves itself with all of this fantastical stuff. And like one of the things I like about Lord of the Rings is it's pretty much, if you know nothing going into it, you don't know how fantastical it's going to get, and you sort of discover that you're never given like an upfront, like here's where it's going to cap out. But the world itself seems relatively low fantasy. Like, I mean, it's when Gandalf shows up in the Shire, like, you know, a wizard hasn't been there in some time, and everyone's excited because it's a wizard. You know, they don't interact with the supernatural very often. So I guess it's
if I may,
yeah, please.
Because kind of answer your thing. So for some of this, I think just to explain what I'm about to explain to make it make a little bit more sense. For like a frame of reference, I use our world, what we live in today, the world of the very unfortunate 2023. And so if it's present in our world, that is kind of frame of reference of natural. And if it isn't, that would be then supernatural or fantastical.
Okay.
And then also, then to direct that is, it's not the world that defines whether it's high or low fantasy. It is the story that happens that sets it, because that's what sets it as high fantasy and low fantasy are genres. They're not settings necessarily. While they interact heavily with the setting, that doesn't, right? It's if you're kind of, when discussing this initially with Ian, we brought up a lot of The Witcher because what Jygg has brought up for the case of The Lord of the Rings also applies for, I don't know, Rosie, who doesn't really leave the Shire ever. And if Tolkien had told a story from Rosie's perspective, where her friends go off and get incredibly traumatized by war and come back changed, then it could be low fantasy, in which she really only interacts with magic when Gandalf comes by with fireworks. But for the case of Frodo especially, who kind of grows up with tales of the fantastical and then chooses to go on that adventure, and Bilbo as well, where strange, wacky, fantastical shit, like such as rings that make them invisible, is normal. That is a tale of high fantasy.
Yes, and I would say, at least for the thing with Lord of the Rings, it spends a significant amount of time where the fantastical is still very not normal to Frodo, and he's like, "What in the world is going on?" And that, I think, honestly makes it even stronger in that regard, because like we get the double, like, this is fantastical not only to the reader but like to our perspective character.
Yeah, perspective character, I think, makes or breaks a work being high or low fantasy. I mentioned The Witcher when I started this explanation because Ian and I were trying to qualify some works that we wanted to talk about on the episode. And The Witcher came up as, what actually is The Witcher anyway? And then Ian said low fantasy, and I said high fantasy.
Arguments for that can be made either way, I think.
Yeah. And for me, I think The Witcher is high fantasy because of the perspective of Geralt, right? His job, find a magic thing, stab it. That's what he does.
Yeah, well, there's like another qualification too, like where high fantasy has, a lot of grandeur associated with the world and the characters. I would say The Witcher tries to be a little bit more dark and a more matter of fact. However, it could be argued that like over the course of time, it's like, it's a hero fantasy, right? And there is like an epic nature, and when you continue to follow the character, like things seem to revolve around him that are important.
Yeah, I do admittedly have limited exposure to The Witcher. I've really only played some of the third games. This is coming from my experiences with that game.
My main exposure to The Witcher is the first season of the Netflix series. So there's that as well.
Oh, you don't need to watch the second one or the third one.
Okay.
Damn.
So there's a couple of things to me that are kind of the distinction between high fantasy and low fantasy. One is a little bit of a world building thing in terms of the presence of what we would consider to be the supernatural in the setting. In a high fantasy setting, those supernatural elements are a lot more commonplace and a lot more obvious. Whereas in a low fantasy setting, typically you would not expect to find very many supernatural elements present. And one of the reasons that I consider The Witcher to be edging into the low fantasy side of things is a lot of what you deal with in The Witcher, what the viewpoint character deals with in The Witcher, are monsters, right? Stuff that we would consider to be from folklore. But the way that they're treated in the setting is naturalized.
Yeah, and they come from another world and they don't belong there, and
exactly.
There's some portal elements, and well, there's magic in the world too, but definitely it is like the anti-Tolkien.
Yeah.
Right.
And I thought it was just like that. I didn't know about the portals.
It's defined by like it's at least, like you can argue that it is like an epic hero tale. But it's defined by its desire to not be high fantasy, I think.
Yeah. The other distinction that I would like to get to there, touching on that, is the scope. High fantasy tends to be broader scope, save the world type things. And there's another subgenre sometimes that overlaps a little bit called heroic fantasy, where the scope is a little lower but still broad. Low fantasy tends to have a very personal scope.
And Witcher definitely has that subtlety.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not controversial, not a huge Tolkien fan here, but
yeah.
It just wasn't that appealing to me as a younger person. Not because, I don't like fantasy. It was just a lot. It was like very detailed. It was very epic. But there is like this thing where everything's epic. Everything has to be epic, or like everything has to be super important. Everything that's happening is critical. There's usually one or more chosen or seemingly chosen by fate, all of the characters or the way things turned out. It's always some type of, there's always like a multi epic component to I think like high fantasy, which makes, things like Tolkien kind of push out of its genre, or like just the broader fantasy genre, into like something easily definable, right? Kind of, don't want to use the word cheesy, but I don't have any loyalty to Tolkien. So again, it's like, there's a lot of like cheese, I guess. Not that literature is bad, that that follows that kind of narrative, where everything's some type of fated event, that the gods somehow pulled the strings to make happen. Maybe there was, a bigger component on the astral plane, to what transpires down below, and, all those things. But I think that's kind of like how Tolkien pushes out of fantasy genre, whereas something like The Witcher is very personal. There's a lot of, there's a lot more detail in like the personal relationships. Not that Tolkien doesn't do that, but sometimes it's pretty raw and gritty. You can very easily view it as if you're not reading a fantasy
Mhm.
book. I think
Hmm.
because it's a lot more connectable, because there is less like super epic stuff happening sometimes.
Yeah, I think for me, Tolkien was one of the early like proper fantasy things I'd read. Um, like not one of the kind of more niche subgenres, but like standard fantasy.
Mhm.
So I have a little bit more loyalty to the concept. I also kind of feel a little differently about some of the stuff. So I think my family read The Hobbit on a road trip when I was real little. I say real little, but I was like probably fifth or sixth grade at the time.
Mhm.
And I was just like, whoa, this is cool. And so then borrowed the book for one day and finished it.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard of the Seinfeld effect?
I have not, I don't believe.
Okay.
I'm gonna refrain from making jokes here. Continue.
Okay. So y'all have heard of the hit sitcom 90s sitcom Seinfeld,
Of course.
starring
It
Jerry
kind
of-
Seinfeld?
I have seen it on the TV as my younger sister watched it while I
I
passed
sure
through the
have.
room.
So for the younger people here, did it seem like a groundbreaking TV show?
I have not seen it. But I know of it.
Yeah, I've not seen more than like
Did it
2 to 5 second clips.
does the impression that it leave you with make it stand out in any way from any other sitcom that you've seen 2 to 5 clips from?
Yeah,
I know where you're going with this, so I'll say no.
Okay, the Seinfeld effect is in fact that, yeah. It's the tendency for a work that was genre defining when it first came out to seem cliche and stale to people who come to it later, precisely because all of the cliches originate from it. And Vesper, I think you're having a little bit of Seinfeld effect here with Tolkien, precisely because The Lord of the Rings, which was written in the 40s.
Mhm. Oh no, I'm well aware.
It's,
of when it was written.
yeah.
I just think the Chronicles of Narnia is a superior work.
You declared war today, I see.
Oh.
Having also read the Chronicles of Narnia at a young age. Actually, I probably read Chronicles of Narnia first.
I think I did as well.
Wow.
How's that for a Portal fantasy? Oh, come on. It's far more interesting, like looking into a water puddle in a magical forest that you stumble upon. Right? And I mean, to me, it's just the way it's written. I don't like hate Tolkien people. I don't like not respect Tolkien, as much as I joke. It's just, to me, that was the more interesting work. But I was already like hyper stimulated at the time, like always growing up. As like with everything. I was interested in like everything, so that might have something to do with why Narnia appealed to me. Maybe the subtlety of what was happening, or just the pacing. People being dragged into it rather than, I might have been caught actually by the low fantasy aspect to it. In a way, as opposed to like, I'm already like big into swords and fantasy and fighting and dragons, and I, consumed every kind of media you possibly can. So, that could be also like, I guess what I'm closing with on that is like, that's also can be like another defensible way to also invoke Seinfeld effect, right? So, I'm just putting that idea out there because that would be another good example. Like, also that aspect of why I might have chose that over Tolkien. Not to say that I chose, but like
why you prefer it a little bit.
kind of didn't really finish, and then one like I just, even though I shouldn't have been reading books from start to finish at the time, because that's people, at my age hated reading, I went through that whole book, and I continued to go through, um, C.S. Lewis stuff.
Yeah,
I pretty well. But Seinfeld effect, right?
I was always kind of more drawn to the concept of someone who's just a dude. Someone who's just kind of otherwise fairly normal can in fact do cool shit. I think that's probably part of why I liked Lord of the Rings and why I liked The Hobbit, because Frodo and Bilbo aren't anyone special. They're just guys. In fact, they kind of don't do anything on their own. Bilbo is, at the open of The Hobbit, content to just kind of vibe.
And it would behoove you to also, know that that's, if you go through the different C.S. Lewis books, that's kind of the story, but it happens with different characters, new characters in each book, like Prince Caspian, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, The Magician's Nephew, probably more what I was talking about with the portals.
Yeah. My problem is I viciously sink my teeth into and blorbo the first character I see.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the different characters come in and out, but I don't think it's like, I think when you pull things apart like we are, it's kind of really fairly a little bit more suspicious that like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien would hang out and write together. Because I think, there's a lot more happening in common, that goes deeper than surface level, and to imagine them chumming around and like reviewing each other's works and ideas and stories and their progress, which I'm sure they did, otherwise they wouldn't be hanging out regularly.
Yeah.
And being writing buddies, I think that's kind of like the bigger picture of that.
Yeah, given that
very much involved in each other's work. They're basically desked together.
Yeah.
Just working on separate things.
Yeah, from my experience, just writing in the general vicinity of other people, especially other writers, y'all are going to influence each other to put stuff you want in each other's stuff. You're not even necessarily going to do it consciously, but it's going to happen. And you're going to go, ooh, but what if you did this? And then they'll go, ooh. And, you'll start bouncing ideas off each other like rubber duckies.
Yeah, and it's, Narnia is a tricky one, right? Because there's elements of low fantasy, but it's the nature of it is they kind of evolve into like a high fantasy, in a weird way, in different ways throughout the different books, the different plot points and, the return and disappearance of different characters. But the reason why I, injected Narnia into this is for that reason, because it actually isn't considered low fantasy, but if you're familiar with the first book, it starts off in the way that a lot of low fantasy things do, in that it drags normal people from a normal world, and they eventually return to it, but there's an overarching narrative, like overarching narrative. An arc is an arch, whatever. That kind of plays on like, so even though, I guess what I'm saying is, even though like they take place in a high fantasy setting, there are multiple books, obviously, and the book is self-aware, right? It doesn't like just make it disappear that the kids are from a different world. and it kind of touches on those topics throughout the thing. Like there are, there's a element of like one of the children not wanting to believe what happened was real, like those things are touched upon, and of course getting dragged back into the world again. So I think Narnia kind of like, tiptoeing around that genre. But since the majority of the book, like at what point do you call something high fantasy, right? If it's 99% taking place in a epic high fantasy world.
Yeah.
And even though Prince Caspian, right, like for instance, is another like interesting one because it does a thing where, okay, the kid's from the actual world that it occurs, but he's a nobody but a somebody, but and then it becomes like a hero's tale. Is he magical? No, which is the interesting thing. His beginning in that book is pretty dark actually, and the conclusion, it that whole book touches on it's more Game of Thrones than anything. Let's put it that way. It does contain descriptions of violence, which is also very interesting.
I was gonna actually propose a segue into Thrones in a little bit, but
yeah. So like, definitely a lot of ideas were played with, but like, at what point is that also like maybe it is still just high fantasy? Because there are characters that have like supernatural powers that come in to try to influence and in whatever they're going to do, right? But it, to me, like even between the different books of C.S. Lewis, like that almost, again, like because of its content, might actually be dwindling down into just more of a fantasy writing. Whereas, like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is high fantasy.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it's also quite I mean, we've been talking about, Narnia and Lord of the Rings, but I'll bring Thrones in this as well. Like, you can actually have different parts of a work sort of be in low fantasy or high fantasy. Like, I think a lot of people have the tendency to describe all three of those as high fantasy for, several of the reasons we've discussed, be it the setting, be it the story itself, the perspective, the story itself viewed through the characters that were given. And I think that sort of means there isn't you can't really pin a needle in it and say, yes, this is exactly what it means. And there was a definition that we gave of, I think, low fantasy earlier, and I am trying to remember it because it was going to be sort of a useful tie-in to all three.
Well, it's like, it's not until something becomes like memeable, right? Like where something has so much of something, right, on the canvas that like you can like say you might as well call that high fantasy, even though like there's a lot of works that arguably are less popular but better, that use the different color palettes a little more interestingly, and maybe not as much of one thing or this thing, and piece that together.
So the two criteria that I gave earlier for how I define the low fantasy and high fantasy ends of this spectrum was how many supernatural elements there are present, and supernatural relative to our world, and the scope and scale of the narrative.
So it's actually a bit of both of those that I had in mind, and that's sort of that scope and scale is, I mean, yes, you can look at as the broader narrative, but of course, in any narrative, you've got the sub-narrative, subplot, you've got your B-plot, and you've got all these different strings going different places, and those subplots don't necessarily have to conform to whatever the main plot is doing in terms of where it sits in high fantasy or low fantasy, in both scope and scale, and in both, how is it focusing on character stuff? Is it focusing on massive world changing events? Is it focusing on the fantastical, or is it focusing on the mundane? Because like in Game of Thrones, at least in books 1 and 2, as far as in the chapters following Robb Stark, it's very mundane. Like, yes, he is a king, or becomes, and yes, he is fighting this massive war, which will have a huge influence on the politics of Westeros, but there's really no magic in that. The other characters are doing magical stuff and fantastical things, but he's not. And then other times, it's, sort of goes, contracts all the way down from, instead of world-changing events, no, we're looking at just this one character's personal life, like some personal crisis that they're dealing with, and there's no magic whatsoever, and it feels very low fantasy. And then one chapter over, we're dealing with, Dany and the dragons, and it is fantastical and epic in every way possible. And so I think the story isn't necessarily, people will describe it as it's this or it's that, but it's not necessarily beholden to any term. Smacking a label on it doesn't determine what it can and can't do.
Yeah.
And I think, I've used Thrones for this, but you could look at the same thing in Lord of the Rings or in Narnia, and one chapter is dealing with one thing that feels low fantasy and the next one isn't. Of course, that's not unique to these three either. It's the entire body of literature that's out there.
Oh yeah, for sure. Exactly the point I was making.
There does seem to be a trend in particularly modern literature for things to blend genre. And so even when you have works that are firmly staying in the fantasy camp, like Game of Thrones and The Witcher, they still wander around a lot within that fantasy setting. Depending on which character perspective you're looking from, what part of the world you're looking at, it can look low fantasy, or it can look high fantasy, or it can land somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, or it can turn into like a raw, gritty, potty mouth comedy, and then turn into like a very intense horror scenario. I guess it also depends on what the scenario is being written is depicted in the style of writing because I think maybe that is another strength to like something like The Witcher, where so many different things happen, but you kind of feel good about what's happening. You don't necessarily disbelieve
Yeah.
that Geralt's a foul-mouthed whatever, and then things are actually kind of funny, but then you believe he's like, walking in the dark woods by himself, and you feel the horror element of like actually hunting a monster, depending on, and sometimes there's a journey, that happens between the outset of searching for the creature and actually even finding the creature, where the majority of the interesting things do happen, right? Leading up to that.
I'm a big fan of mixing genres. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, yet no one has decided to go and mix MacGyver and urban fantasy. And if you did, I would love you forever and ever and ever.
Okay.
Well, I've done it, but
Did you say MacGyver?
I did say MacGyver.
I love you.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of any...
What a great like weird 80s theme song too. It's good enough to like give you the energy and the vibes, but then there's something just off a little about the melody to make it seem slightly discounted compared to the other 80s theme songs at the time. It's like they had like 95% of the budget for that theme song. They're 5% away. There's just a little bit off about that melody. But MacGyver's great. Like MacGyver's in a weird way like low fantasy.
I mean,
I would argue because they're. I mean, what's happening is like not at all believable. Like, and the fact that it keeps happening to him. So you can almost say like there's elements of like high fantasy of MacGyver, right? Because he seems to be the chosen one. He seems to be the chosen one. All these like incredibly complex, important events that for some reason he is the hero and savior of revolve around him. You know, like, and see, that's what I'm saying. It's like there's, you know, that's the cheese I'm talking about when something lays so hard into something. MacGyver is a good example of like low and high fantasy, right? Like I think a lot of these cheesy type, you know, whatever, we just, you know, things that are fun to watch, you know, and something always happens, right? And it's, you know, very formulaic and, you know, it's kind of the same things and you're okay with that, you know? It's like having pizza 3 times in the week for dinner. And yeah, I think MacGyver is both has elements of high fantasy and low fantasy, but then it actually only takes place in the real world. It's really, you know, really strange.
Your mention of cheesiness and the way that we keep going back and forth on like Game of Thrones and Witcher is actually making me think of another thing that kind of changes between high and low fantasy, and that is how black and white the morality is. High fantasy actually tends to have more of a black and white look to it. You know who the good guys are and you know who the bad guys are, and it tends to be the good guys are the good guys because they do good things and anything that the good guys do is good, and you know, vice versa for the bad guys. Whereas low fantasy tends to take a more complex shades of gray approach to the morality. Tends to. There are exceptions to that sometimes. Such as Redwall.
We're going here. Oh, it's been so long.
We're going there.
Redwall definitely has a fantastical setting. One of the hallmarks of fantasy that I mentioned in last week's episode, but only Maya has heard this definition, so I'm going to restate it here. Fantasy looks backward. Some key aspect of the setting is looking backwards into our past in some way. Typically in a way that subtly or not so subtly glorifies it. And how exactly that manifests kind of differs from specific fantasy genre to specific fantasy genre. But typically you get, you know, this sort of medieval European setting that tends to be kind of the default for fantasy settings, at least for us Westerners, right? So you have that with Redwall, this pastoral medieval England setting. But there's no humans. All of the people are talking animals. But other than that, 99.9% of the magic that happens in any Redwall book is rather usually sooner than later revealed to be some sort of trick. Like the only kind of supernatural stuff that happens is when, you know, the chosen protagonist might get a vision from the spirit of Martin the Warrior. So, in the sense that the setting is very grounded, that the scope of the stories tends to be not so world-spanning.
It's world-spanning in a way, though, because it's the known world.
I mean, overall, if you look at the series as a whole, it travels very widely, but each of the individual narratives tends to be focused on solving a particular problem
Yes.
at Redwall or in its environs. However, the morality
Yes.
is very black and white. You pretty much always know that a friendly woodland creature is going to be a friendly woodland creature by what sort of woodland creature it is. And conversely, you know that a creature is going to be villainous depending on what sort of creature it is.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
racist.
Kind of is, yes.
I was about to say
it is.
fantasy racism.
Well, when you anthropomorphize or like give them like a human-like consciousness, then it seems
Yeah.
racist.
It's explored a little bit in one book, but
Yeah, there's not even a lot of subversion of it.
Interesting. I'm not familiar with.
Isn't there
Redwall.
like one subversion attempt that ends poorly?
Outcast of Redwall, yeah. If I'm recalling that one correctly, it's been a minute since I've read it, but it does center around a orphan baby ferret or stoat who's found in a ditch outside Redwall after they fend off yet another vermin invasion. And they decide rather than to kill the baby, because again, good guys always do good things in Redwall books, they take him in. There is a little bit of moral complexity in the book because the vermin child is raised in Redwall but is constantly getting into trouble, and it's unclear exactly how much of that is, the setting saying that ferrets and stoats are always going to be bad, capital B, and how much of that is the Redwallers' prejudice towards ferrets and stoats kind of inclining them to act out.
Also, like, children do mischief.
Yeah.
I have never once known a child who didn't do mischief. Granted, I haven't known a lot of children, but
I think that it does tend to lean in that book more towards Redwallers have prejudice towards vermin, because there are always children getting into trouble in Redwall books. And it is very clear that it's
sorry.
The outcast is getting treated a lot more unfairly, although they do also seem to act out a bit more. So, like, I tend to come down on the side that it's Redwaller prejudice, but like, I think Brian Jacques was trying to write some ambiguity into it and possibly reconcile it with the fact that in every other book, verminous creatures are bad.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like that might have even been like the intention behind the writing too, because like adding that the character does seem to get in this bit more trouble if you're paying attention, but also that everyone else gets into trouble if you're paying attention. Another layer of moral complexity to the situation, and also like that whole layer of if you were treated differently, maybe your behavior only wouldn't be more noticeable or highlighted, but it might change the way you interact with the environment around you, which might, explain like any rebellious child or somebody responding to a hostile environment,
If I was treated marginally differently or even marginally less afraid of social rejection, I would have become Catra as a child. I know this.
I probably would have been, if I was treated differently than other children, I'd probably be up to more trouble than just a little bit more than other kids. Because I'd be very, very angry.
I didn't start getting into trouble TM, capital T, capital M, until I was about high school age, and I could get up to serious trouble. Jygg knows what I'm talking about.
If I may I know we've been, I don't know if this is getting us back on track or leading us further astray.
Welcome to the ADHD talking hour.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier Redwall, and the setting is very different than our world, obviously, because we have talking animals. So that's fantastical and high fantasy in terms of it being very different. The conflicts aren't, though. There's generally not a lot of fantastical stuff. Like it's super adventurous, but there's not really magic. And because I love world building to a fault, and sort of, if you have a setting that's very fantastical, I lean towards it doesn't actually necessarily mean that the story has to be super fantastical. And so you can have this you can have a really alien to our world setting, but if all the characters treat it perfectly normal, the story might actually not even feel that fantastical. And Redwall is sort of like that, because the world is, I would say it's, incredibly alien, because other than all the talking animals, it still feels, things behave like they do in the real world. But you sort of almost forget about that when you're dealing, in the story and the conflicts and everything. It's like, oh wait, this is actually a very different world. Whereas, what's a good example? Yeah, if you have a world that is very much like our own, and I'm going to use Game of Thrones for this, even though, okay, it's not really, but at least for the everyday, there's some level of the mundane in there that might be. But then you introduce like a single magical element, even though there's not necessarily actually a whole lot of magic in Game of Thrones compared to other fantasy series. It can feel very fantastical because that one element is like overpowering compared to how mundane everything is. So it's sort of like it's relative depending on what gets the emphasis in the story. In Thrones, everything could be completely feeling low fantasy, and then, any one of the supernatural characters walks in the room, and boom, everything's different now because there's a literal wizard. In the presence of all the other characters, and not only to the reader, but also to the characters, it feels unnatural. Yet the world itself feels low fantasy.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think part of it too is it isn't just about the content. I think Ian kind of alluded to that too in a different way for some reason earlier, but it's all the style of the writing. What's nuanced, what's emphasized, what's focused on, whether or not the writing, even like how much the writing style shifts from one type of event to again, an event that's a little bit more horrifying and meant to be more of a thrilling situation, or meant to kind of keep you on your toes. I think there's indications or like little nuances in the writing style, how like each part of a story want to be perceived. Like that's where the writer's voice comes in, I suppose.
Yeah, and I hate to just kind of whack this topic in the knees, but we are low on time, and this was something I really wanted to mention during the episode. And we unfortunately we are very short on time. How do the laws of magic, which in particular I'm referencing Sanderson's laws of magic, interact with the differences between high and low fantasy?
I'm not the one. I'm not an expert on this.
Yeah, I am actually pulling that up so I can read them off verbatim for our listeners.
Yeah, while you're looking that up, I'll just give a quick overview of what are Sanderson's laws of magic and why do they exist. And this has to do with the distinction between hard magic and soft magic. Soft magic being stuff like Lord of the Rings, where, and a little bit Game of Thrones, I guess. There is magic. The protagonists don't really have access to it. We aren't really told as readers what the limits and capabilities of magic are in the setting. Whereas with hard magic, it is basically science.
Yeah. And Sanderson is, in particular, Brandon Sanderson is known for kind of being Mr. Hard Magic.
Hence there being Sanderson's laws of magic, which are his guidelines for creating a magic system.
Which I will say I believe apply quite well to both hard and soft magic systems.
Yeah, you apply if you're trying to create one sort of system, you do it one way, and if you're trying to create the other, you do it another way.
So the first law is an author's ability to solve conflict with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands that magic. And to use Lord of the Rings as an example again, because it's almost everyone is familiar with Lord of the Rings, magic doesn't really solve many problems throughout the plot. Most of the time, people have to solve problems. And the magic is not super well defined. It's, Gandalf shows up and does a magic thing, and now there's no more Balrog.
But isn't generally accepted that magic exists in Lord of the Rings and that there are other mages? There is a very defined recorded history of magic in the world. Like, isn't that a part of the world? Whereas something like Game of Thrones, it's like very secretive, very hidden, not a lot of people know. And, one of the few instances, of it is like you don't even know what the entity is. Or if the entity is God themselves in a human form,
Oh,
like
yeah.
the many-faced God or whatever. So, I mean, I feel like Lord of the Rings naturalizes magic, though, in a weird way, in that it is like the accepted thing that there are evils in the world that have magical powers. There is a way to study magic. There are wizards that live well beyond their means and kind of carry this stuff down. I think Game of Thrones is a little more tucked away.
I would say in Lord of the Rings, it's magic exists, but it's pretty much only going to be used by things that have magical power by the act of the gods. Like, it's not there. I wouldn't say there's a study of magic. It's sort of like there are wizards, but they're wizards because the Valar said, okay, they're going to be wizards, and they already decided who the wizards are going to be. Yeah, and I would agree though. Game of Thrones is even one step beyond that, where it's like magic is super obscure. Yeah. I so much apologize. I have to go basically right this instant because the library closes in 2 minutes.
Okay.
Oh.
Before you run off, do you have anything that you want to plug for the listeners?
I'm not exactly sure. I always say if you want to know stuff about Lord of the Rings, read the Silmarillion, but like I feel like that's just how it is. And then read it again and again and again and again because there's always more to get out of that book. But otherwise, no, I think that's really it. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to skedaddle.
Alrighty.
Bye.
Been good having you.
Yep. Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you for being here.
All right, so the way that both of those relate to Sanderson's first law, though,
which is also a Seinfeld thing, by the way, because none of this is trivial to the modern gamer,
exactly,
which is the majority of people now. These are all like,
it certainly seems like it.
These are all like, I feel like people would sit down and write and like not even think consciously about using these laws to try to create.
Yeah, these things being written down is very useful.
Yeah, this almost seems, I don't know how old this is, but it seems ancient.
This is not very old. Sanderson's only been writing for about 20 years, give or take some time before his publication history. He was first published in 2005, but the article that I pulled up from his website only lists copyright 2018, so recent.
Yeah, like the summary, like to me is like, have some basics behind your magic systems, have some lore behind it, have varying degrees of, skill, like just it's just basically I'm reading this as make sure you just include like basic details.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of the few occasions in Lord of the Rings where we have protagonists who have access to magic, typically in the form of elf-made tools.
Ah.
I wasn't even thinking of the One Ring. I was actually thinking more along the lines of like the Sting, the elf forged dagger that Frodo has, or the Phial of Galadriel.
I forgot about that. I think I need to reread Lord of the Rings then. Uh-oh. I was already thinking about rereading Narnia after this episode. That's uh-oh. Yeah, even.
What happens in the end of Narnia, you'll be prepared for, because it's something a lot of TV shows and movies do now, or as they just they completely screw up the ending. So you'll be well prepared for like just accepting that it was fun while the ride lasted when you get towards the end.
Yeah.
Should
so
you choose to get to the end?
Both of those tools that I mentioned, the blade Sting and the Phial of Galadriel, are magical items that are very key to, I believe it was Sam killing or driving off Shelob, which allows them to actually get into Mordor. That was a major narrative obstacle overcome by the protagonists using magic. And the uses of those items were fairly clearly explained, like a book earlier when they get them.
Yeah, Sting glows in the dark. The One Ring makes you invisible. I don't remember the file.
It contains light from a sacred star, which drives back the darkness. And Shelob, being a creature of the darkness, she is driven back by the pure light of the star.
Honestly, I can't blame Shelob for that. You're vibing in your cave. You've been there for a while. For listeners who haven't been caving, I actually have a couple of times. It's dark in caves. You can't see shit. So, imagine how flashbanged you see when you turn on an app on light mode after using it on dark mode for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, crank that up to 11. Bro, I'm not a creature of darkness exactly, but I'd fucking get the hell out of there.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that's not Sanderson's only law of magic, right?
Yes, that is only the first law. He has 3. The second law, which, like in physics with Newton, is one of the more interesting ones. Actually, on this text, it only says limitations greater than sign powers. Although the way I've usually heard it phrased by Sanderson and by others is that limitations are more interesting than powers. And kind of one of the ways I think of visualizing this is if you're playing in a video game, it's generally fun for longer to just play the game rather than to just turn on cheats, give yourself everything. That gets kind of boring because there's no challenge to it. There's no
there's no point in playing. Which is a wonder
well
why anybody would.
There is a point in things like Minecraft, which is part of what I was thinking of when saying this, because creative mode. But
in a competitive,
generally, limitations are going to be more interesting to read than powers.
This actually reminds me of something I've read. Magic the Gathering designer Mark Rosewater has blogged or frequently blogs about designing sets, and one of his tenets is that restrictions breed creativity.
Yeah, we're talking about like basics of game design where the details and basic mechanics are everything. Essentially.
It's interesting how much overlap there is between game design and writing narrative.
Well, I can take it even further. I can take it to just art in general. Art in general is, it's again, like, and actually this goes back to something I kind of said earlier about palette and like how much you use and what your choices are. So it's actually kind of an overarching, like, it's basically like very, very high level basic art. That's one of the things they teach you in basic art is try not, and same thing with like playing music, right? Like nobody wants to hear somebody like play as many notes as they can necessarily. It doesn't make a guitar solo a better solo.
Silence is often more interesting than noise.
Yeah, so it goes up to like just art theory in general. Is the absence of space is also important structure. Just carefully curating what you're doing as you build it out is, very key. The absence of things is important.
Yeah, as for how this interacts with high and low fantasy, you actually set me up really well with that, with the absence of things is important. Low fantasy works a lot with the absence of the fantastical to make the fantastical feel a lot more special.
Yeah. We didn't talk a lot about the magicians, but actually there's a lot of key moments in that show where, there's some really hardcore stuff in that. I personally really like that show.
I haven't watched it, but I don't.
A lot more than Harry Potter.
That's kind of a low bar. That's rude to magicians, frankly.
Yeah, and they had some weird stuff like towards the end too. Like, you don't want to talk about, there's some influence by like I don't know how some of the stuff happened towards the end. Some of it's really great, and then it's like, why did you do that? Level cheesiness, but they do the same thing. They create these really intense special moments. It's used very specifically that way. Like literally having a character kind of like just trying to hide out in the real world, right? And a very evil entity finds that person, and it's very it pops in the darkest way possible. You feel it, especially when you know the history and the characters, and then that kind of becomes like a, I don't want to say like what you'd have like a gameplay loop, story loop in that particular chapter of the story that becomes like the core element. It's very haunting, but the Magicians plays into that pretty well, where they they save the magic, and then sometimes they when they blow their load, and the magicians, no pun intended, but it works for magicians, people use filthy language. they blow their loads. You know what I mean? And they do it in fun ways, and sometimes it's like really inconsequential nonsense, when that occurs, and they include accidents, magical accidents, which is great. They run the gamut in the Magicians, and they have a lot of fun. But I think to me, it's a good example of like the balance between like keeping somebody invested in the story, caring about characters, keeping it dark and gritty. A sense of humor. It humanizes the characters, that they're it's not like the comic relief in Star Wars movies lately. It feels a little bit more real. It just makes you feel closer to the characters as people. But they play a lot with that. The subtleties and different formulas and different ratios of elements and different pacings. But yeah, highly recommend it. Kind of lost myself on a tangent there, but
yeah.
Back to Sanderson's Laws of Magic.
Yeah, I do want to try and wrap this up kind of quickly because Maya is getting hungry. The third law: expand what you already have before you add something new. And that's honestly, I feel that's almost like as much world building as it is anything else, because if you've got stuff, use it. Don't like
you every one of these that you've mentioned, I've been holding back bringing up how many ways Harry Potter breaks these.
Every single one of them is broken by Harry Potter numerous times.
And I think this is one that, even though there's less magic in Game of Thrones, they actually utilize. And Lord of the Rings, you could argue the absence of. But
I would say Lord of the Rings overall follows this.
Yeah, they introduce different new magic elements, but actually a lot of the few magic related fantastical scenarios kind of evolve, and stuff's added to it. They definitely are very reserved in adding any new magical elements in Game of Thrones, which we already established. But I think the Magicians does that too. They do have a lot of magical elements because there is a lot of different magic, but they do a lot of expanding upon their foundations and things that are established. They don't. It's not like they disappear to make room for something new. You know what I mean? And they're not forgotten about. The core laws of the magic is not forgotten about. But they do a lot of expanding and evolving, and building upon what we defined, and that doesn't change as they introduce new elements or new magic, rather. I don't know if Harry Potter's like that. I think it's just a lot of new magic elements, if I'm correct, right?
Harry Potter's just bad.
Yeah, okay. So you'd think that because the core aspect of the setting is that it's wizard school, you would think it's a hard magic, right? Because
no.
you have every book they introduce something completely new. Like book 2 introduces the time turners, and those don't come back until book 6, where they're getting destroyed because they would break the plot if they were actually used.
Except they aren't actually all destroyed, because in the play that Rowling writes, they're included. That happens after all of the books conclude. I think it's a play, at least. It's bad.
And none of the good magicians use a death curse, even in self-defense.
Yeah, nobody's allowed to commit murder as a treat. And frankly, that's cringe.
I found that to be the most off-putting thing about that book. It's nobody nobody defended my boy. You know what I mean? They just let him die.
Also, the protagonist wants to be a cop and doesn't want to commit violence. Like,
Yeah.
why does this man want to be a cop if he doesn't want to use excessive violence?
Yeah, it's like you're just gonna let my mans be murdered like that and not like what kind of friends are you? You guys are supposed to be like friends. Like I would have been thrown off death curses left and right, you know, if one of my friends died in front of me.
Shit.
Yeah, like what is that?
There's also, the, like, massive amount of structural fat phobia, but that's kind of more digging into how Rowling is a terrible person.
Yeah, I'm starting to suspect that like maybe this laws is actually not seriously meant to help writers. Because these are things that people would assume. I almost feel like this is a shot at like J.K. Rowling. Like a subtle, like, oh, this is like, it's a little tutorial. Like this is, just to help people out, or getting into writing. I don't know if it's that. I think maybe this guy has a bone to pick.
It seems to me like the Sanderson's Laws of Magics are like equal parts writing tips and literary analysis.
Yeah.
Now, before we turn this into 15 more minutes of dunking on J.K. Rowling, we are running over time, so even though I really want to know why the script says the Princess Bride is a Souls-like, let's talk about that later.
You will have to ask Whiffled when he comes on later this month, because that was at his request.
All right.
Interesting.
I think that was his request. It might have been Jig, actually, that said that. I got it from Whiffled originally.
Well, I kind of want to know. I'm very curious about this now.
Yeah. Anyways, let's wrap this up.
Do we have anything in the mailbag?
Unfortunately, we don't have any new mail right now. So, we really do love it when people who enjoy listening to this write to us. And I know that we don't have a huge audience yet. So, please, if you like this show, write us a letter, fanfictapes@gmail.com, and share this with all your friends so that they can also get in touch.
Comment, and subscribe.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, Vesper, I don't know if you've heard, but I'm pretty certain you're imploring at the last episode you were on.
Oh, I just heard today, actually, but I don't know what was said. Yeah, that's very sweet.
We got a very lovely
nice
letter.
Aww. And it wasn't from anybody's mothers in here, right?
No.
Okay.
Not
fantastic. Then goal is achieved.
Yeah, my parents would probably just text me if they wanted to do that.
Yeah, speaking of which, like if anybody has anything nice to say, or enjoys listening to people ramble about stuff, then yeah, send a nice letter. Feedback's great. Obviously you don't know what we're doing. I think more arguably it doesn't seem that we really care how this goes down, and I kind of enjoy that aspect of it because it's really just a chat. It's not.
Well, we care a lot about what we do, but what we care about doing is something that you can't care too much about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's very freeform. I kind of enjoy this. I enjoy hearing everybody's kind of like free opinion on things, and but yeah, like share, I guess, beyond writing or subscribing, pass it along. Maybe someone else enjoys just hearing people chat
that would
about
be
a topic. I don't really know what I am here for, so I'm doing my best to at least be a good salesman. But yeah, I don't know. Is that correct? Do you feel like maybe that's kind of the format? Is it's like free form thoughts
Absolutely.
on topics? Is what's happening here?
That's kind of
Because it wasn't even defined to me what we're doing. I even texted you. I said, "So what exactly are we doing?" And this is like the second time like I've been here. So
Yeah, when making the podcast with Ian, and this discussion probably happened back in October of 2022, when we're like, okay, we're going to do a podcast again, and we're going to keep at it. What's it going to be like? We decided on kind of first and foremost having fun. Secondly,
Fantastic.
chat with friends. And the third thing on the list is make a podcast.
So this is like our own Sanderson's Law, you would say. But they're good. I'm for 100% behind this formula. Okay, so I guess that's what we're doing. So I hope that's been helpful to anybody listening. If you think that, like, wow, this podcast isn't that great because it has a lot of, it just seems like people talking, then joke's on you. That's exactly what it is. So if you do enjoy that, I'd say if you can, go one step beyond further and maybe send it to somebody who might enjoy listening to something like this in the background while they're eating lunch at work or, getting work done. It would be very appreciated.
All right, we've even gone on further diatribes than I intended. Oops. You can also find us on Twitter. Our Twitter is @fanfictiontapes, capital F, capital T. It's supposed to be called X now, but
Elon Musk
Elon
is
Musk.
dumb.
Yeah. Look, Muskrat, if you're listening, 1, go yourself. 2, I'm not feeling your baby ego man rage from the 90s. That shit's older than me, let it go.
Yeah, I liked him better when he made cool cars. I don't know what all
When
this
was that?
extra stuff is for.
Aesthetically, Teslas are cool. Everything past aesthetics, though, don't buy a Tesla.
I like to think I stay in my lane when I can,
All right.
We got distracted again.
Maybe we just cut that out. How's that?
Yeah, probably.
All right. I am and have been Maya, and today I was joined by
Vesper, and
As always, I am Ian. Until next time, bye.